Today, I want to talk about how people end up with negative coping mechanisms such as self-harming or self-medicating, or really any issues that uh, are the result of difficulty with regulating emotions. One of the funniest things that God ever did for me was make me a licensed master's level substance abuse and trauma counselor in a residential AODA treatment facility right after a season when I had unfortunately been on the receiving end of some pretty rough religious abuse and domestic abuse. And the reason I say funny is all through that process, people were pointing at the symptoms of the abuse that were manifesting themselves in me rather than drawing their attention to the underlying issues that were causing those symptoms. And unfortunately, we live in a culture today where that's very often the case. People look at, the surface level behaviors that are manifesting themselves rather than looking a level deeper at what the underlying causes are. And one of the things that I've found myself fighting back against in the treatment world is the idea of calling addiction specifically a disease in and of itself. Even going back to when the disease model was first used to treat addiction, it was always referred to as a stress-induced disease, and I think that's far more accurate. So I refer to addictions as a symptom of unprocessed negative emotion and trauma. And when you work under the umbrella of trauma-informed care and look to help people find healing from the sources of negative emotion and the trauma, they often are freed up from the feeling of wanting to seek pain relief in the form of various different kinds of medications, whether legal or illegal. And so I want to just emphasize one more case study along those lines to bring that point home before I get into the lesson that I want to share with you today about piggy banks and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how that works inside of our brains with regards to negative coping mechanisms. So, think about just an example. A parent, let's in this example say a mother who is separating their child, we'll just say it's a son, a boy right now, from their father, and as a result, the boy is having difficulty concentrating in school, very distracted, and so the mom takes that child to maybe a psychologist, psychiatrist, some mental health professional, and says, my son's having difficulty concentrating in school. And they give the diagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and they say, here, take some stimulants to help with your ADHD. So just begin forcing the child to take medications like Adderall or Concerta or other stimulants. And maybe, and I've heard this often from friends that I had growing up who were given these medications, maybe the child doesn't even really like the way they make them feel, and they say, hey, mommy, I don't want to take these medications, I don't like how they make me feel. And you have the professionals and the parent saying, no, take your stimulants, take your amphetamine like a good little boy. And then understandably that child develops a dependency to these abrasive medications, and let's say later on in life when they're an adult, then they find street versions of it, street versions of amphetamine or stimulants. Maybe that comes in the form of methamphetamine or cocaine or just prescriptions, drugs that they're not prescribed themselves. And let's say they get into some legal trouble. Well, what will often happen is the judicial system, the legal system will label them as an addict. And the idea being, well, if we can just get all these addicts off the street, these alcoholics, then we'll have eliminated the problem, rather than the culture as a whole. In this situation, the child, what the real issue is that they're having understandable symptoms of depression, anxiety, and trouble focusing in school because they've had the trauma of being separated from their parent. So rather than treating that underlying issue, just shoving medications on top of it without any psychotherapy to process through those sources of negative emotion and trauma. And then later on, when they develop dependency as a result of that through no choice of their own, we demonize them and label them as lifelong addicts, and just shuck all the responsibility onto them without the culture, in this case, the home, and at large, the community, taking accountability and joining in that. I've said before that a good intervention for someone who is manifesting the symptom of addiction or let's say self-harming even would be if the family or loved ones are coming from the approach of, we see that there's a problem here, how can we all get through this together? It is a we problem, rather than saying, you have an issue, you're not welcome back here until you solve this problem of yours. You're fundamentally broken and you need to go get help. It should always be a we issue, because we are products of our environment, of our culture, and the culture has a tremendous impact on the individual, and vice versa. The individual, this is one of the greatest lessons that Christ Jesus shows us, can have a profound impact on the culture. So now, digging into the lesson, there was a man named Abraham Maslow who created what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the basic gist of it says that there's a sort of there's an arrangement of needs that people have, starting out with their physiological or survival needs, like air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, that until those needs are met, that we are not able to move further up the ladder. Next would be safety needs, like personal security, employment, resources, health, property. Then up a level from there, love and belonging, friendship, intimacy, family, sense of connection. Another step up, esteem. So things like respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, and freedom. And then finally at the top, self-actualization. And that basically is, I'm in the right spot with the right people, doing what I should be doing with my life. And you can think about that sort of like Jacob's ladder, like an ever receding horizon that's always moving into the future, because even once, it's not really the attainment of a goal that gives us the release of reward chemicals like dopamine, it's the pursuit of the goal. And so once we reach one goal, we're always moving and trying to reach the next thing. And that's a beautiful thing. So just this idea that until we have our basic survival needs, it's like we're living in the basement, so to speak, and we can't get out of there until we get those basic survival needs met. They used to think that addiction was housed in our prefrontal cortex, where all of our high order cognitive functions are housed, and they would wonder, why are people under the influence of substances, or who are experiencing symptoms like self-harming or self-medicating, especially, doing things that they would never normally do otherwise. It's like, why are you making these bad choices? But what surprised folks as they studied into doing brain scans on people who were craving or actively under the influence is that wasn't the part of the brain that lit up. It was actually our midbrain, or in our amygdalas, that lit up when people were experiencing addictions, actively craving or using substances. And that completely changes the story, because that part of our brain is responsible for fight or flight, fawn or freeze. And it's like a good analogy is, if you see a bear in the woods, you don't have time to think about, oh, is this a friendly bear? You just need to get out of there. And so it's a really cool mechanism in our brain where our survival brain actually overrides our prefrontal cortex. Our amygdalas, our midbrain, override our prefrontal cortex, and just gives us the extra juice, adrenaline that we need to get out of that situation. But what that means is that part of our brain is only thinking in terms of the next 30 seconds, because again, you don't really have time for high order cognitive rational thought. You just need to get out of that situation. And so people who are actively under the influence or experiencing active addiction are only thinking in terms of the next 30 seconds. I need this drug or this medication or I'm going to die. And that's why they often do things that don't seem to make much sense to us. So now moving over to piggy banks. It's good to think of ourselves and our mental health, especially with regard to negative coping mechanisms or any emotional regulation, in terms of, you are a piggy bank. And ideally we want to just be taking in positive deposits and that's like good news at work, or being with the people that you love, or doing the things that you love to do. We want our bank to be filled up with as many positive deposits as possible. But unfortunately, whether we want to or not, every day we take in negative deposits. Um, that could be in the form of all the way back starting out in life. If your parents were exposed to unprocessed traumas, then those can be carried down to their children. As far as you think of it, like chemical deficits starting out right away in life. I think about the passage, children will pay for the sins of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. That trauma does have generational effects. And we all have the power to stop that cycle, but we do have to turn and face the dragon, so to speak, in order to get that gold that waits on the other side. So maybe your parents started out with some unprocessed trauma that sort of inherited. And let's say you were separated from a parent or a child, maybe experienced extreme poverty, maybe some type of sexual abuse, or maybe some type of religious abuse, or periods of homelessness or joblessness. And these things just pile up. And until we take time to process them, they just keep piling up. And every human only has so much capacity to store sources of negative emotion and trauma. And once it gets almost filled up to the top, it's like we're operating on a very narrow bandwidth. We only have so much of ourselves that we're working with. And it can seem like any new thing is just the end of the world, When our bank is not that filled up with sources of negative emotion and trauma, you can still move on and not feel too weighed down or depressed by it. And unfortunately, that's the mindset that most of our world operates by today, is especially, I would say, a stigma for men, is just keep moving ahead, just stuff it down and keep moving. Don't ever look in the past. Well, when our piggy bank does get to be filled up with all the way to the top, with those negative deposits, then we do start to feel weighed down or depressed by them. And when I worked as a crisis counselor, I would talk with people and how they got to becoming suicidal or homicidal, and we would trace it all back and see all these negative deposits that had piled up in their inventory, so to speak. And they had like a backlog of negative experiences. And it is in those moments then when people start doing things they wouldn't normally do, like self-harming, self-medicating, or saying, I don't even want to live anymore. So in the same way that when we're sick with, say the flu, and we feel all gross, but then we vomit and we get all of that toxic stuff out and we feel a little bit better after that. It's the same way with our mental health, where if we take time to not only get those negative deposits out by journaling or talking about them with people that we trust, but also creating a causal story for how they happened and asking some basic questions to minimize or eliminate the possibility of those things happening again, then we can free ourselves up from the basement, so to speak, and not feel like we're living in survival mode on the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and out of our midbrain or fight or flight or amygdala part of our brain, and free ourselves up to higher cognitive function and being able to think rationally again, because we've cleared out all those sources of negative emotion and trauma. You can do all the cognitive behavioral therapy in the world for someone experiencing active addiction, but it can only go so far until someone has done an honest, fearless, searching inventory of those sources of negative emotion and trauma, those negative deposits, those bad experiences that we've gone through in the past. The beautiful part, again, is when we do take the time to face the dragon, we get the gold on the other side, and we start to find healing and manageability in our lives again. It's always better then, from that point on, once we've caught up on that backlog of negative deposits or experiences, to step on the snakes as they come up, so to speak, because the snakes don't go away. They just get bigger the more we run from them. And our body actually reinforces that we're more like prey animals the more that we run from them. And they just turn into dragons that get bigger and bigger and consume us with fire. But when we decide to face them, they get smaller and smaller. And it's like walking through a wall of fire where you come out refined and stronger on the other side. We turn from being prey animals to people who can fight and defeat dragons, and we're all capable of that. We can all face those negative experiences. So that's part of it then, scooping out and emptying out our bank of all of the negative deposits that have piled up, and then uh, filling them with as many positive deposits as possible, being nested in a hierarchy of social hierarchy of healthy, supportive relationships, and progressing towards our goals for the future. So that means we have to first establish what we want for our future and establish goals, because without clear goals for the future, we can't have positive emotion. So process the past, get those negative deposits out, and paint our future, and surround ourselves with positive people and places and things that are going to help us reach those goals for the future. So I'm going to share a link for a previous video that I did on the story of Noah and his sons that speaks to this point too. That Noah was not just a hopeless drunk after the flood when he got drunk and passed out naked. There was a reason for it. He was actually one of the most faithful men on the planet. And the story blesses those who support him in his most vulnerable state and curses those in his family who used his vulnerability as a way to elevate their own status rather than showing love and support. And so may we all be like Noah's wife and his sons Shem and Japheth, who supported him, and may we all help each other carry our crosses up the hill together, so that we can all find healing and head towards the light. Last thing I just want to share is along these same lines, it's good to think about us having a piggy bank for all of the relationships in our lives. So the more that there are things that we aren't talking about, it's like we're filling up our bank for that relationship with negative deposits, unprocessed sources of negative emotion. And the more that we do that, the less that bandwidth we have for that specific relationship, and the more that relationship is going to suffer. So in the same way, it's good to think about ourselves as a piggy bank and staying clear on our inventory for our own mental health. We need to do that for all the relationships in our lives. Love is the most important, so we lead with love, but there can be no love in the absence of truth. And we all need to use assertive communication, which basically just says, I'm feeling this way, this is why, and this is what it would take to improve it, in a respectful way that respects not only the feelings of the other person, but our own feelings as well, so that we can keep our inventories clean and our own relationship banks and stay healthy and supportive. So I'd love to hear any thoughts that any of you have to share on any of this. This page is a constant communication, but just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you today from my office here at my current role as a substance abuse counselor. God be with you. Take care. I hope you and your families are well. Until we meet again.